Good afternoon, everyone. I have to say I'm just thrilled and honored to have a chance to be here. Amy, thank you so much for organizing today and inviting me to participate. David, for all of your support along the way, planning along the way. I have to say, we have a superstar panel to talk about infrastructure, and I'm just so honored to be up here today with Promita, with Lisa, with Sammy. They'll each introduce themselves in a moment. I want to talk just for a moment about infrastructure and infrastructure for scientific communication. That's our topic today, and I want to talk a little bit around and from a publication that I recently prepared with colleagues from Ithaka SNR, including Oya Rieger and Tracy Bergstrom, looking at the shared infrastructure that supports scientific communication. And where we kind of started and where we ended is that infrastructure is essential to scientific communication and open science. We probably don't always talk about it enough in those terms. We're so interested in the policy and the incentives and all the great things that we've had a chance to speak about already today. But all of that is enabled or impeded ultimately by the infrastructure, by the technical infrastructure, in some cases the social infrastructure that actually undergirds it. So there are enormous benefits to providing infrastructure on a shared basis. And I think that's one of the things that we often sort of assume or maybe sometimes overlook. It includes things like the scale effects, the economies of scale, the ability to build towards a different level of quality than if you're just building yourself, and similar kinds of factors like that. But at the same time, shared infrastructure is maybe even most important because it enables smaller participants in an ecosystem like like society publishers, for example, to stay in the game. So put another way, there are certain kinds of shared infrastructures, if they didn't exist, that would have a negative effect on the marketplace. So shared infrastructure is, in that sense, at least certain types of it, are really foundational to a healthy marketplace for the kinds of open science and scientific communication that so many of us here are interested in. There's a lot of different models that can support shared infrastructure. That includes various kinds of not-for-profit as well as commercial organizations. We have a great array of different organization types represented here today, even though our panel's not going to be speaking just about their own organizations by any means. I think their experience is really grounded in different kinds of organizations, which is intentional and I think significant. And there are also, but I also want to separately emphasize that there are trade-offs to shared infrastructure. So it's not like, oh, let's just share it and then it will be good. Sometimes we talk about things in those terms and it can be quite misleading. When it's shared, it's rarely agile and rarely flexible, or at least not as agile or as flexible as it would be if a single benevolent dictator was in charge of it, right? And so, you know, much of the shared infrastructure that we have today, not all of it, but much of it was really built for what I've come to call the first digital transformation, the transformation that many of our organizations and many of us individually made from a kind of print publishing model to that first digital publishing model. Let's get some PDFs out there, right? And today we're experiencing a second digital transformation. Today we're going through a transformation where many of the structures, the workflows, the incentives, and even the outputs that characterize and drive scientific communication are being revamped, in some cases in fairly substantial ways, as we've been hinting out and speaking about today. That's why we're here today, because of the enormous opportunities, but also the non-trivial risks in this second digital transformation. So we need to ensure that our communications infrastructure, particularly the shared infrastructure, is fit for purpose for this emerging environment. So I hope that that kind of provides a little bit of a kind of background, at least as I see some of the issues from a from a maybe too high of a level, and now we're going to ground ourselves in some greater specifics. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and speak for 3, 4, 5 minutes about some of their perspectives on these issues, and then I have some specific questions for each of you. Promita, would you like to start?
Sure. So thank you again, Roger, for inviting me, and thanks to Amy, Nick, David. Wonderful, wonderful gathering, and already the rich conversations we've had. Thinking about the positionality, I guess the positionality that I'm bringing here is building infrastructure for Diamond Open Access journals and also for institutional repositories. So I'm Promita Chatterji. I'm Director of Journals for Digital Commons. In that role, I essentially am the Director of Products. So I work with lots and lots of institutions. We have about 3,000 open access journals on our platform, and we work with around 600 universities worldwide, but primarily in the US. Like Roger said, I'm here kind of to present my perspective, my experience working with the community and supporting open access initiatives. But a lot of it is through my, filtered through my experience working with Digital Commons, the product. Which, as you probably all know, is part of the Elsevier family of research products. But our history, some of you might know, is that we were a company called bpress. And I started with bpress about 10 years ago, 11 years ago almost now. So I've been through, all of the different kind of aspects of it. And I think what I wanted to share a little bit is, two kind of principles that guide us, or have guided sort of my approach to building infrastructure. And a lot of those really do come filtered through sort of like the mission of the Digital Commons platform itself. I think we were all really inspired by Adam's talk earlier this morning, and I thought it was really interesting that he's an economist, because Digital Commons was also founded by 2 economists at UC Berkeley. And so the idea of incentives, which we've been talking a lot about here today, was kind of very, sort of baked into building infrastructure I think in their mindset. So the idea of like, for us, it's been much more about putting the carrot out there for researchers rather than the stick. The carrot for the researchers, for the university, and actually for the readers. So we do a lot of stuff in our product to showcase impact and to showcase, to make it worth someone's while to share things open access. So that's one thing that we think about a lot, and that's part and parcel of our product, and something that I have researched quite a bit in working with the community. And then the second thing that I think about a lot is an article that most of you probably all know. It's by Clifford Lynch that he wrote, I think it's a little bit over 20 years ago now, and it was called The Institutional Repository Essential Infrastructure for the Digital Age, or something like that. And Roger, it really reminds me a lot of what you and Oya wrote about in your paper as well. And Clifford, this was really a visionary article if you haven't read it. But going back to it after all these years, he really describes sort of a future version of what does it look like in the research community to be working with scholarship and with research that's born digital, and he's really painting a picture of that in the future. And it's really quite profound in the way that he talks about this kind of infrastructure, not just as products or as, technology or whatever, but really as a set of services. And that's, I think kind of the approach that we take is like, how can we support the research community, especially, we work directly with university libraries. How can we support university librarians with doing the work that they need to do? And some of that work is about open access, open data, et cetera, publishing, but it's a lot about supporting researchers where they're at. And that has changed over the years, so we really work very closely in understanding use cases, whether it's about supporting open access journals, whether it's about green open access, whether it's about supporting data, and even, more now what inspires me so much is working with students and young researchers. So we have a lot of student work, students. The article is, I'm not sure what if the article is going to be that central atomistic piece of research going forward. So, that's something that I think about a lot as someone who supports infrastructure and the product perspective. Oh, you got it.
Figured it out. So hello, everyone. Lisa Janicki Hinchliffe at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. You've probably figured out I am not Lori Schultz from the University of Texas, and Lori was unable to be here today, so I guess I'm the closest thing who was actually going to be here, because Lori in particular was to talk about persistent identifiers, which I'll get to in a second. But I want to share with you that I actually work in one of the longest standing infrastructures for scholarly communications, which is the library. The library predates the university. It predates institutes. It predates a lot of things, even those things that have managed to survive for a long time. And I think sometimes we forget that we actually have this incredible, national, actually global infrastructure in our university and research library system that, was really optimized over centuries of effort to be there in the ways that scholars needed in order to do their work. And I'm just old enough that, in my very first pre-professional job, I was helping people find where one of our 12 copies of science was in our university library system. I'm very ashamed that I sent them to a further away library than they needed to go on my first day on the job. But all to today, right, where we are making those subscription journals or other things curated, available to them on their desktop, on their mobile, sometimes open access, sometimes not, but trying to be as in the workflow of scholars as possible, and of course students as well. So I have more than 30 years of working in this environment and just sort of thinking about how longstanding, enduring the infrastructure is, and the network we've also built so that no single library is actually an island, but every academic library serves as a node in this globally connected network infrastructure, where we have a lot of agreements about how we will share information with each other, pass information around, and the like. So it's actually quite a reliable infrastructure and quite a resilient infrastructure. And I would actually point to the success of academic libraries during the pandemic as one of the actually least disrupted services at many institutions, because we already were quite digital forward in the delivery of a lot of our services and collections. But I'm also here as the chair of the board of ORCID. And the role that persistent identifiers now play is, if you will, sort of a linked data infrastructure for scholarship, in the way that together persistent identifiers, ORCID for people, DOI for things, RORs for organizations, et cetera, are creating an interlinked graph that allows relationships among scholars, their works, their employers, their funders, et cetera, to be brought together in ways where we can actually even do science on science, but also allows us to think about how we can build other services and tools that enable people to take advantage of this linked data. So I want to also just sort of bring into this conversation, I was looking at the questions that Roger provided to me as I was on the plane yesterday. And he's like, can you think about, infrastructure for open science? And I was really struck by thinking about where the word open is. And so I think libraries and persistent identifiers, we're infrastructure for science, okay? Not just for open science. And that's important, that we're infrastructure for all of those things, in part because we want science to be as open as possible, but we know that sometimes it needs to be closed. But also for us to think about, how do we want to think about actual open infrastructures for science? So we can move that word open around in the descriptor. And this is one place where I think we could look to ORCID as sort of a case study of a nonprofit member organization, we can talk about this because you do need money, to try and be as open as possible across all of your aspects. So ORCID being itself open infrastructure, in the sense that open is actually one of 3 values that guides ORCID, the other 2 being trust and inclusive. When I looked across our core principles, the word open or other things appears in 4 of the 10 of the core principles of ORCID. And ORCID itself is quite open to all. If you have a role with scholarship, then you can have an ORCID. If you think someday you might have a role with scholarship, you should get an ORCID, right? It's very open. It is also open to membership. If you are a contributor to science, to scholarship, then you can become a member of ORCID if you're an organization. So these are very, very limited parameters. Also, the registry is open. So any of us can go and look at any particular record in ORCID, but something I've learned people don't all know, we also have open APIs. We have an anonymous API as well as a public API. And we also have an annual public file of our data going back to the very beginning. So you can look at those ORCID data files every year since 2013. ORCID also makes all of its ORCID developed software available open source. And so should you like to spin up your own ORCID? Go for it. But there's other pieces that we've done. So I think, there's certain things that we can't make open because of privacy reasons, employment reasons, security reasons, right? All of the things that we're aware of. But when we can't make things open, then ORCID's other value that comes into play is transparency. And I think we talked about all these things a little bit today, but I just thought I would kind of put out for you the way ORCID is sort of conceptualizing what does it mean to be an open organization for open science and for science more broadly speaking as well.
Hello. Yeah, perfect. All right, thank you for organizing the day, first of all. I think that's how everyone starts, so I'm just going to continue that. And I want to share an observation that scholarly infrastructure seems to be a term that was mentioned in every panel before us. So I'm quite excited to be talking about it and to sharing also my perspective. And the way I see scholarly infrastructure just generally in the context is that scholarly communication is at a breaking point, as I observe it, and we're really facing complex and ever growing complexity in the system and dynamic challenges, but we're relying on software and technology that really stems from the 90s. I think Roger in the beginning emerged to that, and I think that world in which all of these technologies started to emerge simply no longer exists. I mean, we moved on quite quickly. So we're using outdated tools to solve basically modern problems. And it's time that we basically face, and I'm just taking a very well-known word here, an inconvenient truth that the infrastructure is really holding us back in our further development and in so many aspects around business models, around testing out different formats, testing out different ways of doing peer review. So infrastructure really is one element that is holding us back. And I've spent most of my career in scholarly communication dealing with those challenges and spending time thinking about those challenges. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Moderator, which is a company that focuses very much on workflows, so journal, manuscript submission workflows, but also integrity workflows more and more, which is a topic that in the last 2 years definitely spiked radically. And our aim has always been to bring much more transparency into the system and really support people to work on that concept of increasing trust into science and trust into research. And I've not only that eye on scholarly communication, but I'm always trying to look at it also from a startup and entrepreneurship perspective. So I'm very much involved in the world of startups and entrepreneurship in Europe and also here in the US. So trying to bring that lens also into the discussion. And what my strong belief is that commercial dynamics are very much key to innovation. And I'm going to repeat that because that's sort of my key belief, that commercial dynamics are key to driving innovation. The question that I'm asking myself, though, is that I feel in science, in the world of science, that innovation must be anchored in very clear governance structures and in very clear principles that is being ruled by a very strong non-profit sector, and that's the key thesis that I'll be bringing to the conversation. So competition drives innovation, but science must remain a public good. So we cannot really rely on typical market forces alone. And the analogy that I'm trying to always bring is the analogy of a street. Basically, all the streets that are being constructed outside, they must be built to connect people from A to B, and all these ideas should be created not based on commercial interest, but in order to connect people from A to B, and much like that needs to be the responsibility of governments. And much like scholarly non-profit organizations, is to ensure that these streets exist, that are free and easy to use, and connect the right locations. And the building of those streets, I feel, needs to be done by commercial organizations that basically drive down costs. We have been talking a lot about costs of that infrastructure that bring innovation to the game, and you know that are basically incentivized by a very clear method, which is money. And in scholarly communication, we need I think, a similar structure, but that balance needs to be striken very, very, very carefully. And I think an additional challenge that we're seeing in scholarly communication is that we have added layer upon layer in terms of complexity, and we've patched up a system that now is, you know, really creaking under the weight that we're seeing it, and I feel it's really not the question anymore if we need to change something, but rather when. And given certain dynamics also in the last couple of weeks and months, I think that time is really now. So to finish, I'm really calling for sort of a collective courage and a collective action to change and to really look very, very carefully and deeply into scholarly infrastructure, and not to work in silos, but really bringing the industry together, policymakers, funders, innovators, and it will definitely not happen overnight, or change will not happen overnight, but the earlier we start, the better we're prepared for a future where AI and so on and so forth really are at the center of our conversation. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
It's all me. I'm sorry. There we go. That's right. It's shared. So as you can see, we have three, I think, very insightful and complementary perspectives here, and some provocations as well that I really appreciate. So I'm actually building in a way off of where you left us, Sami, to ask the panel about how we actually should fund and govern this infrastructure. We clearly. It may not be that it's one answer for everything, right? I mean, I appreciated, for example, your emphasis on sort of the innovation that one model makes possible. And Lisa, implicit in what you said, that another model allows for endurance, right? And I think sometimes we might have an opportunity to think through like different models for different kinds of infrastructure. But whatever the exact model, infrastructure needs capital investment on a reliable basis and operating support every single year. And so bearing that in mind, how will we fund and govern the infrastructure? Who'd like to jump in?
So obviously, I'll stick to ORCID, I think, rather than speaking to all academic libraries here, because I think it might be a little bit more germane to where this event is focused on. So I think that, part of it is you have to think about what is the product that's being delivered, and what sort of infrastructure are we talking about? So if we're talking about infrastructure where there is competitive tools in the marketplace and not everyone needs to be using the same tool, then I can sort of I could get a little closer to some of the things Sami is saying about competitiveness driving innovation. For what ORCID is trying to do, which is to be a unique identifier for every person involved with scholarship in the world, we want one. We want one ORCID. Now, it doesn't mean we actually are the only personal identifier system, but ORCID emerges out of a world in which there were commercial competitor numbers, right? Scopus ID, researcher ID, every proprietary system was trying to keep track of the authors that they were indexing, and that didn't allow any sort of joined up look at scholarship or joining up of these resources. So given that you have a single infrastructure and you want everyone to rely on it, you probably want a slightly more conservative approach to how you want to go about this. So, I mean, I would definitely say ORCID is a more conservative organization in our risk tolerance because of what we have promised the community. And what we have with the community is a single point of failure, not to keep me up tonight, but we have a single point of failure in ORCID, right? And so we want the ORCID registry to not be subject to the whims of the market or to really sort of risky investments or the like. But that doesn't mean every piece of infrastructure needs to go that way. But there's something very specific about this kind of infrastructure. And I think we could say, you know, to a certain degree, DOIs have sort of a similar sort of characteristic, ROAR, some of these other things where we kind of are looking for a global infrastructure that's uniform and unique, but singular. And that creates a different dynamic. So, I mean, I can tell like how we are supporting ORCID is never charging researchers, charging members, not charging for the data, all sorts of things like that. But ultimately, it's just a much more conservative model of how we're going to grow over time.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I think on the ORCID example is a good one. We've talked before about the sort of the idea of maybe separating the evaluation and the dissemination. It was sort of a theme that went through, and just looking at that example of disambiguating maybe two types of elements, I also strongly believe that with shared infrastructure you can have a similar model in separating governance and separating basically the ground idea and the ground principles from, and now I'm speaking sort of from a technical perspective, from that technical innovation where you basically have still a competitive marketplace on who builds the best tools to actually work on IDs, or who builds on a better server farm or something like that. I'm just taking examples. I think that putting those two ideas together, so the governance and the technology too strictly, might be something that actually hinders innovation, and there could be some optimization. I'm just trying to be a little bit provocative here, Lisa.
We give you all the data, so go ahead and innovate away.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's a big question, and I like Lisa, I don't think I can, take the whole thing on, but I can talk a little bit about our experience, or just my conversations that I have with libraries about funding, because, we kind of get into it with them. And, a lot of times what I do is I talk to librarians who are, people like AJ, scholarly communications librarians, who are trying to make the case for either, starting some sort of infrastructure on campus, or more likely to renew the funding, right? So they have to show success. And what does it mean to show success sort of at a university level? And it can, there's so many different pressures, as both Sammy and Lisa are pointing to. Some of the pressures have to do with sort of bigger funder mandates. Some of it have to do with innovation. But oftentimes with universities, especially in the US, universities are looking for ways to distinguish themselves. We are a much more decentralized system than university systems all over the world. So what we found, sometimes that really works in terms of making the case for university funding is, by making a case that open access is helping the university showcase its unique contents, its unique research, its areas of strategic success. More and more we're seeing things like cultural heritage or unique collections, which are often fonts of like really interesting and unique research being developed. So those are kind of the conversations I think that click for us. The other thing that I've been thinking about with this whole conference is this idea of public access versus open access, and thinking about like how that, kind of inherently or implicitly implies different kind of funding structures. So I haven't figured it out yet, but something to think about.
I figured out how to work the microphone. So I think one of the things that's really interesting in this conversation about funding is how easily it spills over into governance, or at least certain kinds of governance. And so I want to kind of talk about specific kinds of governance models for a second, right? We have community governed not-for-profit organizations, like I think ORCID would fall into that kind of category. We have publicly traded companies. We have privately owned startups, capitalized startups. And so, we have these different kinds of models for like, what are the sources of control, if you want to put it that way, ultimately, of the infrastructure. And obviously, it's not so simple. There's lots of different factors at play. But, if we're thinking about this question about how to balance agility in terms of, right? I mean, one of the questions that I've brought is to try to frame things, and Sammy said too, that there's a sense that some parts of the infrastructure anyway have not been agile enough, have not really kept up with the needs. So can I ask you, like, how do you see the governance at that level connecting to how we stay agile, how we remain fit for purpose? Are there things we can learn from some of maybe not from your own organizations, but from initiatives that haven't succeeded, maybe even some that have failed? Would anyone like to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to look at it from sort of that innovation angle, and really try to comment on where I feel we need the most agility in terms of in terms of sort of necessary innovation to improve the entire scholarly ecosystem as such, and just generally looking at it from sort of an, I'm trying to combine your first question and your governance question. And when thinking about that question, I was thinking a lot about venture capital, private equity, and really that concept of do you really give out, or how is that control mechanism governed within startups, within corporate entities, and how can that be connected to non-profit organizations and non-profit entities to still find the right balance between governing from sort of a public goods perspective and governing from a perspective of agility. So to the question very clearly, I think it is sort of a very big balance that we need to strike on saying where do we need, in what kind of structures do we need much higher governance because the stakes are just way too high, versus where can we afford to create a much larger sort of ecosystem with higher innovation, with more possibility of failure, with more test, fail and iterate, and I think having much more conversations around that balance is something that I personally haven't seen in too many conferences, too many conversations. So it's not an answer, rather a comment, really. Balancing out sort of more governance in certain area, less governance in other areas.
I can chime in to that a little bit. I mean, I think this kind of goes back to the question of sort of like what's at stake here, right? It's from the working with university librarians, what's at stake is, kind of stewardship, right? So creating a governance structure so that there's some sustainability of the scholarly record going forward. And I guess, I can just speak from our perspective. Part of it for us is creating a system. I'm working with one of these 90 stacks somebody's talking about, and working on moving, I'm launching something next month, hopefully, moving forward onto newer infrastructure. But that question gives me a little bit of queasiness. But I think for us, the biggest approach is working, working with communities, or trying to work with communities as much as possible. And I think, going forward, really that's going to be the answer, is creating sort of these, using different interoperable standards to ensure that, we aren't necessarily dependent on one particular product or one particular company or one particular system, because whether it's being built, sort of by the institution itself or by, an external company, there's a lot of questions going forward. So I think it's about creating that system of interoperability using standards.
So I think I'd make a big picture observation that I think at its most fundamental, the governance between an organization that has members and an organization that has customers is quite different. And so, both of them have stakeholders, right? Members are stakeholders, customers are stakeholders. But I do think that there's a quite different thing when the people who are availing themselves of the service are also sort of creating the service. Now, they're creating it. I don't mean literally that our members are necessarily programming code. I mean that they are co-creating the organization and the expectations for it. I also don't mean that 10 million researchers are voting on things, right? We have structures that enable us to move along. But I kind of want to, I do think there's quite a difference between when you're talking about taking customer feedback and when you're talking about taking member feedback, and what your obligations are to members, the relationships you have with them, the things you need to manage. I also kind of want to distinguish, and I'm kind of really leaned into the sort of conservative, et cetera. It is in our name, right, that we are creating a persistent identifier. If it is not persistent, we have failed, right? So there's a clear mission that is creating something that's enduring, resilient, reliable. That doesn't mean that how we do that is necessarily, slow or et cetera. It means that when we choose our how, we always have to keep in mind the impact on that mission of persistent. And so we can use agile techniques. We can use responsive and participatory governance structures that are more efficient as we do that work. We just can never jeopardize the mission, which is the persistence. And so it is absolutely a balancing act, and there's no question that there are times where we move more deliberately, I might say, as opposed to slowly. Some deliberation takes time. There are processes for going faster, but I do think, ultimately, if you actually look at ORCID with about 2012 to 2024, it's not that old. It has an incredible user base around the globe. It's always been a virtual organization. It didn't have to pivot to virtual because we've never had an office anywhere. We do have a place you can get mail because you have to have that for the federal government. But a lot of these things that sort of people hearken to as being more, those are built into the organizational culture of ORCID, even if they're not built into the product. But ultimately, the speed, the innovation is in many ways driven by how fast we can get members, because the persistence means that we need to ensure a very stable and reliable revenue stream. And so I think, Roger, I'm thinking back to some of the pieces you've written in the kitchen and other places, thinking about maybe some initiatives in our space, perhaps related to preservation or other things that haven't quite succeeded. And it seems like when I look at a lot of those, there was not as much attention paid to, if you will, the business model. actually ensuring that there was stable as well as the opportunity for capital investment as needed. And so that's something that ORCID's board spends a lot of time on. I'm looking at Daniel Hook, our previous treasurer out here in the audience, thanking him in my mind for all the work he did in that role to really help us set that up. So that we have both ongoing dollars, but also mechanisms for sort of saving up so we can then be sure we can do capital investment, which honestly has meant in certain cases having to explain to the community, our members, why we appear to have money in the bank. And that the money in the bank is important because no venture capitalist is coming to ORCID with the goal of making a big profit out of investing in ORCID. And so there's also this participatory, like this educational process that you have to do when you have members that I think is also a unique part of governance. I think that's everything.
I think this is such a great colloquy that the three of you are offering us here, because what I'm, I think we've heard so much dialogue in the broader community around infrastructure in these spaces, around questions about, should all of the infrastructure always be open? Or, is there some kind of, threshold that we have to meet? We've seen efforts to mount not-for-profit or open source competitive alternatives with some of the commercial providers, driven by that kind of interest in a kind of open source or not-for-profit community-owned alternative to commercial providers in these spaces. So I think that this colloquy that we're having around where and how can these different principles actually play themselves out, to me is just fascinating. And the reason why I think I keep coming back to this question of agility and recognizing that there are a lot of other values here and a lot of other principles we need to speak about is that, when we've come to a moment where there are new issues that have popped up fairly suddenly in our sector, and here I'm thinking about things like research integrity, which surely has been a problem that's been brewing for a while, but sort of popped into the open all of a sudden, or fraud and misconduct, related issues in trust in science, and this moment, this sort of political crisis we're having with misinformation and the information environment that we live in more broadly. Like to me, the question of how quickly the infrastructure can move to embrace some of those kinds of principles becomes really important. And so anyway, I'd love to kind of talk about some of those specific issues around research integrity, et cetera, and where do you see those fitting into this overall conversation about infrastructure? Lisa.
Okay, I'll start this time. So I think one of the interesting things about research integrity in ORCID is to sort of give ourselves a little bit of credit in that one of the things that has really emerged in our attempts to sort of deal with research integrity broadly has been this notion of signals of trust. And we hear this sort of in a lot of different places. And, one of the things people may not realize is that from day one, every piece of data in the ORCID registry has not only said what the data point is, but what its provenance is. And so is this a piece of data that came from a researcher themselves? Is this a piece of data that came from an employer? Is this a piece of data that came from a publisher? And so although that data is now being used and we've enhanced the presentation of it, it was there. You could see it. We've made it easier to see now with including record summaries, so you can see how much of the data is validated from a publisher. Just last week, we released a new approach 2 weeks ago, where even if a researcher doesn't want to show their ID of their email address, so they don't want their institutional, we now have a mechanism of saying, we're not showing you the email address, but we can tell you we have an institutionally verified email on file. So a lot of this was built into the infrastructure, and what we're seeing, to Sammy's point, is Sammy and others being able to take this data because it is a collective good in the community, and then use that data to feed it into different workflows, either at publishers or with those who are competing in this more competitive marketplace, to say, well, we can take that open data and we can present it in a way that's going to be valuable to you in a publishing workflow or the like. So the data is sitting there as a community asset, supported by members. And I do want to say, we are very grateful to both our not-for-profit as well as our for-profit members of ORCID. But I think ORCID itself, only works because it's a not-for-profit member organization. But that doesn't mean, so in some ways we were ready for the research integrity crisis. We were not predicting it, but we were ready for it, right? Because we were already showing that provenance of data. So that sort of very careful data design that probably was, I can only imagine how many meetings were held and discussing that, and do we show the provenance, do we keep it, all that, it takes money to keep all that had to be debated out through a deliberative process, but has really shown to bear incredible fruit. Because that is the only place that some of that data is currently available in any sort of public and validated way.
Yeah, and just to build on what Lisa just said, I think that this is a beautiful example of non-profit and for-profit actually working really, really well together. Even more so, where the for-profit world is actually benefiting from strong infrastructure such as
your members, right?
Yeah, very happy and proud. And I think that needs to be guaranteed for almost all time. But what my observation lately is that there are actually dynamics out there that actually also might hinder competitive forces within for-profit. I'm not going to name, but maybe there's some ideas in the room where I feel that is then getting dangerous, where there's a sort of conflicting and contradicting forces that are working against one another. I think, again, just to also share that positive note, I think that ORCID perspective and how for-profit companies are using that, I think that's exactly how it should be. And to where you started your question, I think that balance, this is a good example of where the balance should be. Competitive forces driving innovation, but there needs to be strongly governed and strictly governed non-profit entities that are basically sharing data or whatever it is.
Yeah, I am going to 100% agree with them. I think I was at a conference in August in UCLA on where a lot of this was talked about, and it was a lot about ORCID, but also all the other PIDs, and sort of a future where we see kind of linked data that helps to reinforce systems of trust. So I think that's something that we're looking at too. But for us, doubling down again on the library perspective, we work really closely with librarians who are trained in this all along, right? So, vetting content through that library perspective and that concept of stewardship.
Great. Well, we want to have time for questions. I think you've already stood up to get in line. So I'm happy to turn things in that direction. I have other questions if we need them, but we'd love to make sure there's time for good engagement. Would you like to begin?
Thank you again. It's Albert Hinman. What was brought up earlier was this focus on the dimension of research integrity. Another big emphasis over the past decade is broadening science education, science research activities, include different institution types in parts of the country that were not part of this enterprise historically. I think what you all brought up is that the current system has been built on over decades, had many times a reform, and a lot of these systems were really built well to go in the pandemic and provide some of this digital delivery. But in terms of the institutions that may not have been built up over those decades, yet have a lot to offer in terms of teaching, research programs, et cetera, how do you feel on an operations level that you might start to engage and really help diversify the audiences and really kind of build them into this new portfolio? Just any sort of ideas or takes you all have?
I can start with that a little bit. So you're talking about sort of teaching and learning materials.
Teaching, learning, or even just gathering information being part of the communications.
Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to, what I originally said in my my opening statement. One of the things that we think about a lot is not just about, open access for the end research product of, or a research article, but sort of like the whole, the full spectrum of content that's created, especially at the university level. And we do work with a lot of smaller, liberal arts colleges, teaching colleges, et cetera. And it's essentially a question of culture. As more and more products are created that are born digital, research outputs that are born digital, basically they need a place to live, right? So, it's part of the university's imperative, to share that and to be able to showcase it, and also to be able to, as it's shared, people find new ways to make use of it. So we found with a lot of our universities, especially teaching schools, being able to showcase, say a student capstone project or data collection that was done by an undergraduate in conjunction with a professor. These things are so helpful in so many different ways. It's helpful for the student down the line. Some of these things are discovered and help inform public policy. And then, for a lot of universities, it's key to their recruitment. And these are things that are sort of part of the broader ecosystem around, sharing and public access, open access.
I think one of the things I would mention with respect to ORCID is we're really well known, obviously, for listing people's publications, but an ORCID record also has space for presentations that you give in at a conference. It has space for publications that you have that didn't go through sort of the formal journals process, books, et cetera. So I don't want to say you can list just anything, right? It needs to be scholarship. So, but, the undergraduate student who is a research assistant and gets that, co-authorship with the faculty member, maybe, or publishes in an undergraduate journal, that is legitimate for listing on an ORCID record. And so I think one of the things that we, people could think about, knowing that ORCID is there and persistent, is, I think a lot of times with, particularly I think about some of the initiatives to get women into science, BIPOC folks into science. Part of that is helping them sort of see scientists that are like them. And so ORCID records are one place you can find those folks. But the other thing is that they start to see themselves as a scientist or a scholar. And you can start building your ORCID record before you even have any publications. So if you intend a career in scholarship, you can have that ORCID record. You won't have anything in it yet, but you can have it because you intend this career. There's only one thing you can't self-list on your ORCID record, and that's peer reviewing activity. All peer reviewing activity that appears in an ORCID record has to be asserted by a publisher. But everything else can be self-asserted. And so, there's, presentations, et cetera. So it doesn't get to all of your question, I think, about teaching materials and the like, but I would encourage us to think about how we sort of think of some of these infrastructures as also building blocks for things like recruitment, and particularly reaching out to some of those communities that we're trying to create pathways into science and scholarship.
Please.
Okay, let me remember my question. So I kind of want to go back to the point of signals of trust, and I think this question specifically for Lisa, but I'm going to try to make it general first and then make an example. So how do we, again, trust and integrity, how do we make sure that when we bring new signals of trust, we don't recapitulate the same issues that push people away once again? And one of the things I love working, in fact, peer review is not a publisher. We actually can write on the peer review. If you're a peer reviewer, you get an ORCID, you get it directly on your ORCID profile, but as a scholarly activity. So the example that I have with that came out a couple of weeks ago is that by defining someone who has validated affiliation account via ROR as they have a trust marker, the issue that I have with that is that then the person that doesn't have that has less trust. And so I've already talked to some members of ORCID. So I think that just for me, gives me a pause, because we are an organization that we get the only barrier to access peer review is having an ORCID ID. And we're constantly saying they should put ORCID, create an ORCID ID, is that even my grandmother can make an ORCID ID, which is sometimes offered as like, I found your weakness. My grandmother can make an ORCID ID. I was like, that's exactly the strength, right? That's why I want my grandmother to be able to, right, if they have anything to contribute. So, but my grandmother would be signaled as less trustworthy, not on pre-review because we are a member, but like less trustworthy on ORCID in general because, but let's just go past the grandmother, but like a previous, what I'm getting at. So I wonder in general, like as we are thinking more about these signals trust that can help us with like, create, like parse out all the volume, how do we really focus on this issue of making sure we don't recapitulate oppression?
Right. So just to sort of summarize what she's speaking to is that in the record summary for a person and at any individual, you'll get sort of like a dashboard, and it'll say Lisa has 80 publications or presentations and 35 of them are validated, which of course means that the rest are not. They are self-asserted. And so you get a slider scale, right? From somebody who everything on their ORCID record is fully validated to nothing on their ORCID record is fully validated. It's only self-asserted. And so it is difficult to get across that you are adding trust. There's no negative signal from self-assertion. So it's difficult. It's not Right, yeah. So this is a challenge, and we are quite aware that, and this actually maybe goes to governance and some of these other things we're just talking about, which is one of the effects of this is there's an unequal access to validation across the globe because publishers validate via Crossref and other DOI providers. Well, if you're not putting DOIs on your articles, you, even as a publisher somewhere in the world with less resources, then your publications that you publish are not going to show up as validated on the ORCID record. So one, I want to just say we are very aware of this and spent a lot of time talking about this before we did this from an equity standpoint of making the summary. But the second thing we did is that we are working to actually remedy the core problem, which is that there is global inequity here. And I do think this is also something that comes to governance, member organization, and the like. So it is possible that in a commercial environment, you might say, this is not a commercially viable market, so we won't enter that market in this region of the world. ORCID does not have that as an option, nor do we want it as an option. We want everyone in the world who's involved with scholarship. And so you may have seen a couple years ago that ORCID had startup funds from a number of the commercial publishers, so nice to have those startup funds that were given to ORCID in the form of loans. Those loans, when they came due, we were prepared to pay them, but we went to those publishers and said, publishers, if you would forgive this loan, we will take the money we would have paid you and we will invest it in our Global Participation Fund, which has allowed us to heavily discount ORCID membership in low and middle income countries, as well as do investment projects in technologies that those countries or those regions are more reliant on to get them to a position where they're able to benefit from the ORCID registry and of the services we have. Because sometimes the problem isn't ORCID is ready, it's the problem is the software in that country is not ready. And so we're actually investing in their infrastructures so they can then connect to ORCID. I don't know if you do that in a commercial way.
I think unless there's any pressing responses, I think we should move on to another question. I didn't see who was up first. Daniel, okay.
Daniel Hook, Digital Science. So thank you for the interesting discussion so far today. I think it's been really interesting. I think everything that we've seen so far has really kind of taken for granted the fact that we seem to be operating within a particular set of cultures. So, I mean, global research, as we see it, has really been dominated by, Western values, by Western cultures. It has come out of the Vannevar Bush kind of innovation post-1945, when the US has been by far the dominant power in the world. But we're now entering a period of much more multipolar politics, multipolar cultures. And we know that other cultures have different approaches to research, different approaches to asserting truth, to understanding truth through different lenses. And each of those may have its validity, and they may be things that actually enrich research and make this a more interesting place to be. So my question to the panel is, how do you conceive of common research infrastructure in a multipolar world and in a multicultural world where we see an increasing diversity in research and in competing approaches and perspectives to how you value truth?
I can start with that if it helps. So I think I mentioned one of the things that my current role is I'm leading Digital Commons Journals, which is a Diamond Open Access platform. And one of the benefits, one of the many benefits of joining Elsevier a few years ago is that we've really been able to broaden out our reach into different areas. We've worked on the Diamond Open Access model since the early 2000s. So we were a real leader in that area, mostly in the United States. And we saw a lot of value in that model for, folks in the humanities, folks in the social sciences, folks in kind of emerging or interdisciplinary areas. So we saw like a lot of big, for example, exercise science journals or Food and Drug Administration, those kinds of journals. As I've been working with more and more folks in different regions of the world, I've been having some great conversations, and it really kind of brings up what you're talking about. A lot of journals which are considered sort of like local journals, which might not be published by like sort of the STMJ part of Elsevier is not going to be coming knocking on their door. Incredible research that's happening, incredible research communities that are being supported, and sometimes in a multimodal way, kind of as you're referring to, Daniel. So it might be like a journal, but that's very integrated with a conference that happens, for example, or maybe it's integrated with an archive. So, one of the benefits of the Digital Commons model, which has been going back to this kind of thinking about research as a full spectrum, we've had that always baked into our product, and we're seeing it come alive in really remarkable ways as we're working with these different kind of communities, research communities across the globe. So that's one thing that I'll say that I've been really enjoying.
And maybe just to add one more point to that, I think it's also a question on product design in a sense. And we've discussed about product design earlier. I think that we can learn a lot from software companies around the world, companies building products that internationalize from one market to other markets and actually acknowledging for different kinds of principles and set of ideas, where you basically have an engine that seems to be sort of standardizable, and then you layer on top a dedicated set of specific, local front ends, to just speak a little bit more software-y. But that's sort of the perspective that I would take there.
So I'm going to wrap us up, but I can't resist just offering one other perspective on this terrific question that you've raised, which is that not all of the effects of a multipolar way of thinking are going to be positive for the values of science that many of us here hold. And I think it's I don't mean to be dour or negative, but I also want to recognize that as we negotiate some of those dynamics, we see things that push against openness in some countries or cultures, or push against participation in the idea of a global commons for science. And I also want us to be sure that we're taking the best we can and offering the most we can, but also being realistic about what's possible and being prepared for what else is to come. With that, I hope measured and not negative note, I want to say a really hearty thank you, and I hope you'll join me in thanking these three terrific panelists.